Welcome back. So, I'm a bit shocked to say this, but Blizzard have actually unveiled a total overhaul to M+ affixes, and it's got me, somebody who did not like affixes whatsoever, actually excited. And it's not just the new things, neat as they are, they've also removed WoW's least popular affixes. In fact, they've pretty much gutted all the affixes that you know. It's pretty insane, and I'd say this is likely the single largest design shift we've actually seen to this system. First, here's what's been removed. Sanguine, Bolstering, Raging, and Bursting are just gone. Then the goofy affixes that led to us making this video last week are also gone, and the affixes that those goofy affixes were supposed to replace, which are Afflicted, Incorporeal, Entangling, Storming, and Volcanic, well, those are still gone. So in other words, other than Tyrannical and Fortified, all affixes that you knew are gone. Now, I know what you're thinking. What bullshit are they going to put me through this time? And the answer is affixes that actually risk being fun. So in place of the old, we now have a cluster of affixes called Xal'atath's Bargain. They're themed around her, and they're all Kiss Curse affixes. That's just a shorthand for saying that they have upsides and downsides. And not only do we have this new set of affixes, the overall system is also now different, with varied progression up until a point, and then, for those who love to competitively push keys, we have changes that will give them a more consistent experience. Basically, no week will be push week, and every week will be push week, so ain't that something? Now, before I dive into the Xal'atath affixes in detail, let's just look at the entire system, and I'll do it with a sample week. So here's our sample week. At Mythic +2, one of the Xal'atath affixes will be active. That's it. No Fortified, no Tyrannical. Then, at Mythic +4, Fortified will activate. At Mythic +7, Challenger's Peril will activate, and Challenger's Peril is a new affix that causes dying to subtract 15 seconds from the timer, up from 5 seconds. Now, that is more punishing, but I do think it is in the context of a more fair system. Overall, there are fewer affixes, and that means dungeons will be a more consistent experience. I think that makes the +7 affix completely reasonable and fair. Then, at Mythic +10, Tyrannical also activates. And that means that at M +10, both Tyrannical and Fortified are active at the same time. Now, I understand people's gut reaction. It's along the lines of, what the hell, Blizzard, are you trying to stomp upon my balls? But it's not really that. First, remember there are fewer affixes total, and the Xal'atath's Bargain affix can benefit you if you play well. Secondly, the Warthin's equivalent to Aspect Crests will drop from +9, which is before both Tyrannical and Fortified are active. And while we're not sure about the Great Vault's gear, if it does max out at like +10 or +12 or something like that, I do think that's broadly reasonable considering it is competing directly with Mythic Raid loot, and Mythic Raid is not only harder but also does involve more organizational work. So in terms of weekly variation then, on one week you'll get Fortified at +4, and you'll get Tyrannical at +7. Another week, you'll get Tyrannical at +4, Fortified at +7. Those basically just rotate in the order that they activate, and then at +2, you'll get one Xal'atath's Bargain affix. Pretty simple, and with that explained, we're almost done. I say almost because the final thing happens at Mythic +12. Mythic +12 kicks in what I call competition mode, where two things happen. First, the Xal'atath's Bargain affixes are disabled, and second, they're replaced by Xal'atath's Guile, a 20% buff to enemy HP and damage. Now that might seem horrific to you, but remember, Mythic +12 is likely beyond where you'll be getting better loot. That's the sort of thing that is designed for players right now who just love pushing keys to get a higher rating. That's how those players play, and for them right now the game is very frustrating. There are differences between Tyrannical week and Fortified week, and between some affixes, and that means that for them some weeks are easier to push than others, often to the point where beyond just filling up their Great Vault, there's literally no point in them playing Mythic Plus because the current week's affixes won't allow them to push their rating. And that's one of the things that leads to the idea of push week, because it's basically the only time where at the high level you actually can push your rating. So with this change, that no longer exists, and competitive players get a consistent experience. And when you look at the Mythic Plus run data from the Blizzard API, you can see that the older system had a negative impact. Like, literally, if it's not push week, you will see less people playing. And when thinking about competitive players, remember, what they want is a consistent set of rules and balance. Imagine playing Counter-Strike, but the layout of DDoS 2 changes. Imagine playing Summoner's Rift, but with weekly affixes. Or being a Mario 64 speedrunner, but where cosmic rays flip bits and end up breaking the competitive integrity of the game. Okay, that one actually did happen, but you get the point. For that type of competitive style play, they want consistency so that they can train, practice, and shine. But if you're like me, what does this mean for you? Well, it means overall fewer affixes, like straight up fewer affixes that you will notice in regular gameplay that will like be right up in your face or just mildly annoying you like a storming would. Most of the affixes just make the numbers harder, and the one that you do actually have to play around, the Xal'atath's bargain one, well, only one will be active during a week and you can benefit from it. And that does mean that a lot hinges on Xal'atath's bargain actually being worth it, so let's take a look at the two they revealed, Ascendant and Frenzied. Now, Ascendant causes Xal to rain down orbs of cosmic energy. Here's some footage of it. Now, if the orbs get their cast off, an enemy gets 20% haste and movement speed stacking, which is pretty brutal. But if you run through the orbs or just stop their cast by any means, they'll be destroyed, and you'll get 1% haste and movement speed per stack group-wide, and very regularly that's meaning people are getting like 20% haste for like 20 seconds. So that actually does feel real powerful. The next one then is Frenzied. It's basically just a mob in Rage where non-boss enemies become frenzied at 30% HP, they get 40% haste, but they take 20% more damage. So you can see that yes, that's more dangerous, but also you'll literally kill those mobs faster. You definitely will have to play around it, and it's less directly interactive than the other affix, but you can see how there is a pretty clear risk-reward to it. Those are 2 out of 4, and we haven't seen the other 2 yet. The big question for me, though, is how often will these change? Will they be per expansion? Will they be per season? I mean, I do like that inherent in the design here is theme and change, right? Like, it's very much fantasy forward. The idea is that Xal'atath is screwing up your dungeon experience, but also you can play around that and get some benefits. It's a little bit like how the affixes actually work in Delves. And I know you might think, oh no, affixes, Delves, this is terrible. Not really. Basically, Xal'atath has this, like, lieutenant dude, and buffs from him go onto mobs. It ends up working with the fantasy, especially so in the case of Delves, because that guy is then the boss of the secret 13th Delve. So I think that means that even if you're a Mythic Plus player and you've not really paid attention to any of the lore, by the time you actually fight Xal'atath in this expansion, you'll have felt her messing around with your dungeons. She'll actually be mechanically introduced to you as a character. So I think that's also pretty strong. And I know it's a game, a lot of people are just mechanics first only, but I do think that fantasy and cool factor is just extremely important. Now, I also then like how this is themed in a way that's basically like a seasonal bunch of affixes that are lighter touch, rather than having one seasonal affix that wholly dominates how a season is played. I think that is far more player friendly. Also, that only one is active at a time means that, like, when you're doing a dungeon 1 week to the next week, you're basically comparing one thing that is different. I think that just means there's a better signal-to-noise ratio. Now, to be clear, we can still red team this. Red teaming is the idea of basically just role-playing as like the opposing force and trying to poke holes in an idea. It's a really healthy thing, actually, in design discussions, in my opinion. Now, to red team this, you could say that, well, some people won't like Ascendant. It still is kind of in their face. You could also say that, yes, while it does require and very much rewards smart use of your AoE stuns and things like that, well, what if it is a dungeon that's full of mobs that just cast things that are sore? Then this will be competing for utility. And you could really go along those lines, poking a million different problems in it. And again, so much of this will just come down to balancing. But on the topic of balance, I think it's very notable that all of this stuff turns off at Mythic plus 12. There will be no Xal'atath's bargain, and at that point it is seemingly more of a like intended, like proper competitive mode. Again, designed for the sorts of players who actually enjoy that. I mean, Blizzard basically said that for the longest time they were trying to make a game system that people enjoyed very broadly, even though they're very, very, very different players. Basically, it was one size fits all, and it didn't really work that well. So basically, from my personal emotional opinion, looking at these changes, I do think that this will be way more fun, and this will be a permutation of Mythic Plus that I could see myself playing and enjoying more, especially because it is built off the back of the Heroic Dungeon experience and the regular Mythic Zero Dungeon experience being more robust, being harder than they were in the past. I think that is particularly strong. And look, getting a big haste buff actually feels good. Like, it just makes your second-to-second gameplay feel fun. Having enemies take more damage when they're in execute range, like for certain specs, that is going to feel pretty damn awesome. With almost every other affix in the game, it boiled down to, what bullshit will I have to deal with this week, right? That is what it boiled down to. Here, yeah, well, there may be a little bit of bullshit. It's a thing to play around with a reward. That makes all the difference. And if I was to roleplay as a more competitive player, I've got to imagine that I would appreciate that consistency in the experience, which just makes it a more level playing field, where you're not looking at the calendar and thinking, okay, well, I'll schedule that in 3 weeks the affixes happen to look good, and maybe that's when I can push. That just doesn't seem like a fun and healthy way of play, so I'm glad that this basically aims to kill that. There's also the topic of testing in devs. That is particularly strong here. Look, they had a wave of affixes 2 weeks ago, and those were kind of picked to pieces by players. And it's not like those affixes were just some old development fragments that snuck their way into a build. No, they came with a blue post announcement explaining their intent. Players basically said no, didn't enjoy it, and within 2 weeks, we've got a new idea of what Mythic Plus is, one that is not defensive. Like, this is actually bold. This is actually developing the game, rather than just tweaking little bits of it here and there to try and make it ever so slightly better. No, what you need to do to get people excited is make proper big, bold change, ideally that is theme and fantasy forward, in line with the sort of core pillars of the game experience, and I think that is what this achieves to do. Now, obviously, the main problem is going to be balance. Balance with specs, balance with classes, balance with dungeons, and how quickly they're able to tune those things. That is a forever problem. Like, literally, no matter what you do, that is always going to be something you will have to contend with as a game designer. I'd at least say that here there are fewer affixes that should confer some benefits, but that being said, with the rotating of Tyrannical and Fortified at +4 and +7, and then with the scaling really being cranked up at the top end, there could be road bumps in the difficulty curve. That may not feel good, so they'll definitely want to make sure that they get that right. And obviously the same goes for the timer, because Tyrannical and Fortified are pretty different. They are pretty different in their impact, on an overall runtime. So having one or the other at Mythic +4, I mean, you gotta wonder what that will be like for the timer. And then finally, there's the whole topic of rating, where they've basically said they're working on it and they don't have something to announce. I think that makes sense, because it's not like we've got a Tyrannical week and a Fortified week. We basically just have them in different orders. Now, that does absolutely change the texture of difficulty of those Mythic Plus dungeons, but does it do so to the degree where then you need to split your rating in two? A little bit tricky to say, so I'm kind of keen to see what their thinking is on that. Overall, though, I think this is really positive and it's got me excited. Another thing that's got me excited is Delves. We will have a video on that tomorrow. Be sure to check that out. We've published an overview of a bunch of new UI changes, so you can check that out as well. And of course, a big thanks to our team at Bellular.Games who keep the team running. Okay, with that, cheers. I'll see you next time.